We're here with members of the Microsoft Systems Architecture team. Gurpreet Paul is the Senior Director of the MSA initiative. Dave Quick is an architect on the MSA team. And Jim Dial is the head architect of the MSA initiative. So can the three of you tell us what MSA is, and then we'll look at MSA from the point of view of the application architect and developer. Please start with Gurpreet.
Okay. MSA is an initiative from Microsoft where we are trying to build proven architectures for implementing infrastructure and solutions based on the Microsoft platform, working very closely with partners. So we build blueprints, and then we document the best patterns and practices that are associated with those blueprints. We test them end-to-end in the lab, and we provide implementation guidance. One of the key uses of Microsoft Systems Architecture we've seen with 50 or plus customers in the last 1 year is as a platform for developing and deploying applications. So that being the number one reason for MSA adoption, what we've done is we've paid a lot of attention to making sure that it is a great platform for, you can say, an application infrastructure for deploying and developing applications. The things that we do over there is we make sure that we document all the reasons that and the criteria that a developer should look at when developing application against a secure, highly available, scalable infrastructure. The next thing is we also provision some of the key services that are required by developers as part of Microsoft Systems Architecture when we implement it. So things like data services, other middleware services like MSMQ, COM+, and then on the .NET area, implementing and provisioning .NET frameworks, UDDI, and those things that are going to be required for web services and .NET application development. So that's one of the key goals for MSA, to be the best target platform for application development deployment, providing a standard environment that can really make it much more rapid to develop and deploy applications against.
So what are some of the issues? A classic problem is it works on my machine from the point of view of the developer.
Yeah, so one way to think about that is oftentimes what we see happen in the real world is you have developers who try to use the latest technologies because they think that's going to help provide the best possible application to support their business. And what ends up happening is there are things in the infrastructure that they depend on that they're really not aware of when they build their application. There are things they use to build their application that the IT staff doesn't know is going to cause problems when they deploy it into the infrastructure. And so one of the critical things that we believe that we can help with within MSA is to actually help identify some of those areas so that we don't require every developer to become an expert in infrastructure technologies, and we don't require every IT person to become an expert in developer technologies. Now, we're not going to claim that we're solving all of those issues, but in the guidance that we provide in MSA, we're actually highlighting some of that and making it easier to understand where that bridge lies and establishing that communication, that conversation that has to happen between IT and developers, establishing that earlier in the cycle rather than waiting till you try to deploy that application.
Now, from the point of view of infrastructure architecture, how are you presenting that to developers?
So we have a document in this release, as Dave had mentioned, called the Application Infrastructure Architecture document. And what we've tried to do in that is to present some common deployment scenarios of 2- and 3-tier and 4-tier applications. So in some cases, those tiers from a developer's perspective may all reside on the same physical box. In other cases, they may reside on separate physical boxes. In other cases, even still, there may be firewalls in between those boxes. So as we start to introduce complexity into that environment, we have security context that we have to deal with from box to box. We have ports that may or may not be open. As you had mentioned previously, there's the it works on my box scenario. Well, when that thing goes to production, it's locked down. It's not everyone full control. It's not that environment that's conducive to making things work anymore. It's an environment that's conducive to only making the things that need to work. So we tried to present some of those scenarios in that document. Hopefully those can be beneficial to both the infrastructure side and the application developer side to help them start to speak each other's language a little bit more. A classic example, I think, is the use of DTC. So a developer knows they need DTC. The infrastructure person says, I know I need some ports open through the firewall, just tell me which ports. The application developer says, I don't know which ports, I just know I need DTC. And the infrastructure guy says, well, I don't know what ports DTC uses. So we've tried to shed some light on some of that in that document to help both sides understand a little more, and as Dave had mentioned, so that they can start to speak each other's language a little bit better to accomplish that objective.
Now, you're working on MSA on new versions. Can you tell us what's in development right now?
So what's in development right now is our MSA 2.0 version. We've released our 1.5 versions. There was something called the Enterprise Data Center and the Internet Data Center. Those are both available for download on TechNet today. The 1.5 series were based on Windows 2000 as their operating system. There are other products that are part of that infrastructure as well, things like Exchange. In the case of the IDC, we had some guidance around BizTalk and Commerce Server as well. But moving forward in the 2.0 timeframe, everything is based on the Windows Server 2003 operating system. So that's the primary difference between the two. We're working on that today. It's similar in scope to the Enterprise Data Center release in the 1.5 series as far as the services it addresses and the type of guidance that it provides. So in this release, aside from the operating system, we've added the application infrastructure architecture that's new in this release. We've revved the other stuff, and we've also changed the approach to the guidance a little bit, so it's a little more explanatory as to how we arrived at some of the decisions we arrived at.
To add to what Jim said, I want to make sure that the way we've built MSA is to be very modular. And we know that developers may require various services or application servers. So we provide guidance on what other typical application servers, like for orchestration, you would use BizTalk. Where would you put that, right, as part of the architecture? And where would you deploy those services as part of the architecture? That doesn't mean that we necessarily test everything, but if we were going to put it, that's where we would put it in the architecture. One other key thing that we are trying to achieve, and Jim kind of alluded to that, is we are trying to bridge the chasm that exists between the application architecture and the application development side of the house and the infrastructure side of the house. And we've seen, talking to enterprises of various sizes, that they have somewhat of a definition of an architecture that they're working towards, but it's rarely documented, and there is no clear understanding on the application side of the house on what the infrastructure architecture is, on the infrastructure side what the application architecture is. So we are trying to bridge the chasm and make sure that when the developers go in to develop an application, they know what to expect from the infrastructure side, and it's very clearly documented and communicated by the infrastructure side of the house. So that's one key area for bridging the chasm between development and IT.
Now, I think one of the contributors to that chasm between the application side and the infrastructure side is that developers don't develop within the data center. And of course, the data center equipment is very expensive, and it's very hard to, or it's a large problem to basically to create that environment within the dev environment. So what are do you have any ideas for developers who want to have their environment be closer to the actual data center environment?
So one of the things Capri had mentioned is the modular structure of the guidance that we're releasing. So the first piece to that is that the developer need only deploy the things that are necessary for that environment. So for example, in the EDC 1.5 release, not our current release, but a previous release, if they were developing for that environment, that has Exchange in it. The developer may not need Exchange in their environment, so therefore wouldn't need to put up Exchange servers. And along that line, when you look at the diagram for our releases, it is somewhat overwhelming because there are a lot of different services and things in there, a lot of which are not required in certain development projects. So Change would be a great example of that. WINS may not be required. WINS is in their file servers, print servers. Those things may not be required either. The next piece of that, though, is because security was a big part of the design, there's also a lot of separation of services. So in a development environment, the DNS and AD functionality may be put on the same physical server because you just need that functionality there. Whereas in a production environment, those may be separated out for security reasons. So I think that's the first thing to do, is to assess which services you need. The second step would be then, based on those, do you need the level of separation that we had? And then the third level is, do you need the level that we have from a scale perspective? So obviously if we have 4 web servers in a load balanced cluster, unless you're trying to test out your scale, if you just want to test functionality, you may be able to get by with 1. Or even further, with the introduction of Virtual PC, the Virtual PC product from Microsoft, you may be able to run those types of things on your developer workstation. And we haven't tested those, I'm just throwing that out there as a suggestion, but there are certainly strategies on ways to decrease the number of servers and services in the environment to achieve whatever the developer is trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think an area in the one difference between the 2.0 version that we're working on now and the 1.5 version that we shipped is that in the 1.5 version, we primarily focused on examples of how to do things. And in the 2.0 version, we're also adding to that the ability to understand why we did those things, understand the principles. So as a developer, you can look at, okay, I see that they're doing this in their design, and this is the reason that they're doing it. And then you can look at that reason and say, what part of that do I care about in my development environment? And focus on just implementing those areas when you set up your development environment. And it gives you a lot better picture by understanding what the guiding principle was on what you need to focus on as a developer.
Also, in standing and testing the infrastructure, we not only provision those services from the data center environment. I got one. And we not only provision those services from the data center environment, but we also make sure that they are thoroughly tested. So we test some exerciser or sample applications as part of this effort. Some of the applications we've tested are some industry standard applications like Nile, FM stocks, and they actually exercise those components and services that are part of the infrastructure that are primarily being provisioned for the developer. Another thing is that when we are deploying and testing these applications, we run into scenarios that a developer and enterprise would run into anyway. For example, leveraging the Active Directory. So we have techniques on how you would leverage the Active Directory, right, while in a production environment, right? So you could develop against, you cannot, so you can develop in a much more real environment. So we do have that part of our test cases and our strategies, which we share as part of the documentation and guidance.
That's great. One thing I'd just like to add here is that through the .NET Architecture Center, we do have a common way to access both application and infrastructure information, and the MSA products are all available directly through the Architecture Center. I just wanted, that's a little bit of a self-serving comment, I guess, but it's it's important.
Yeah, there actually is an interesting thing that we've started doing actually just recently. In the developer community, there's been a lot of work around design patterns, architecture patterns, implementation patterns, and just within the last few months, we've started to work on the idea of applying that same thinking around patterns to IT and infrastructure types of projects. And so shipping either now or in the very near future on MSDN are 3 patterns that we develop around the infrastructure side of the house. Those are focused basically on load balancing or clustering. And they're quite useful to look at from a architectural and from a design perspective, because from an architectural perspective, you can look at the problem that you're trying to solve. without necessarily focusing in on which technology or which product. And then from there you can say, well, what are my design options and how do various products fit those options? We think that will be a very valuable thing for infrastructure people to understand moving forward, and we expect to see a lot more patterns in that space.
And just to clarify, that's right now the patterns are available, including the application and infrastructure patterns, as one piece in something called the Enterprise Solution Patterns for Microsoft.NET.
Yep.
Anything else to leave us with?
No, I think I'm on. I think we want to make this a platform that's useful to both the infrastructure side of the house and the application developer side of the house, and we certainly welcome your feedback. We have an email alias that's set up called MSAFDBK@Microsoft.com, and we welcome feedback from both sides. If you find it usable, please let us know that. If you don't find it usable, let us know that too, because we build this to be useful for you. So if it's not, we absolutely would like to know that.
Yeah, in conclusion, the only couple of things I wanted to say in terms of futures is that we want to make Microsoft Systems Architecture as a very, very robust and attractive platform for development and deployment of applications. Another thing that we would encourage, as Jim mentioned, is evaluate it, use Microsoft Systems Architecture as a target architecture for developing applications. I would also encourage solution providers and independent software vendors or ISVs to make MSA a target platform for their development and deployment efforts. That way we can drive standards from an architectural perspective and a technology architecture perspective. And I think that would be very, very useful to both enterprises who are buying and building the various solutions for their enterprise.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.